short is that a lot of people here have just enjoyed a very nice dinner and probably would like to curl up and go to sleep. I was really trying to, I hope there's lots of strong black coffee back there for those who need it. If anybody wants to get up and get it while I'm talking, please feel free to do so. Before I start talking about China, I would like to tell you a story about a letter I just got from a friend of mine who's just passed away. He's another journalist, died and went to heaven. He was met by St. Peter, assigned a guardian angel, and the St. Peter said, the guardian angel will take you through the streets of heaven and show you where you're going to live. So they set off down this wide boulevard. Way out at the end of the boulevard was this huge mansion. And the guardian angel said to my friend the journalist that this is where you're going to live. And he was sort of taken aback by that. Those of us who have spent our lives working for mean wages as ink-stained wretches are not used to living in big houses. Anyway, they went into this house. It was a magnificent structure, magnificent mansion, mahogany stairways and so forth. Met the staff, the butler, the sous butler, the upstairs maid, the downstairs maid, the chef, the chauffeur, a whole bunch of people. Went out to the front of the house, and here is an English box garden the size of a football field. People out there trimming the hedges and mowing the grass and so forth. They go down to the end of this magnificent garden and see a row of little bungalows down there. And out in front of one bungalow is John Greenleaf Whittier working on his lawn. And next door to that is Walt Whitman, who's sweeping off the front porch. And next door to that is, I'm a New England Yankee, you'll have to forgive me, my favorite poet is Robert Frost. And on down the line, and my friend the journalist said to the guardian angel, I don't really understand this. You've got all these great poets, these literary giants living in these little bungalows, and I'm going to be up in this huge house on the hill. I don't quite understand. And the guardian angel said, actually, it's quite easy to explain. We have lots of literary giants up here, but you're the first newspaper reporter we've seen in 237 years. Whether China is surely the most pressing long-range question in Asia today. Nation of 1.3 billion people, a surging economy, but problems with unemployment, with poor financing, and uneven distribution of the new wealth. A nation of some considerable political stability under the Communist Party, but one in which there were 85,000 incidents of civil unrest a couple of years ago, as reported by the official news agency Xinhua. There have been more recently, I'm sure people in this room are aware of this, of the uprising in Tibet before the 2008 Olympics, and in this past summer, the civil strife between the Han Chinese and the Uyghurs in Xinjiang in western China. China is surely a growing military power, but one with a whole litany of weaknesses in command and control, in joint operations, and in logistics. In diplomacy, China has become very much active in the international arena, but it really hasn't accomplished much, as you can see by the failure so far of what's known as the six-party talks on denuclearizing North Korea. Even so, with all these problems, all the weaknesses and the strengths, this is a question that will affect our lifetimes and those of our children and those of our grandchildren as far into the 21st century as anyone can see. It encompasses issues of war and peace, of economic progress and turmoil, of supplies of energy and safeguarding the environment, of just about any aspect of human endeavor you can possibly think of. As some of you may know, the Chinese like to number things. That comes from a Neo-Confucian philosopher named Xiaoyun in the 11th century. He believed that the key to understanding the world lay in the number 4. The universe is divided into the sun, moon, stars, and the zodiac. This planet has fire, water, earth, and stone. Ideas have 4 manifestations: and actions have 4 choices. So in good Neo-Confucian scheme of things to come in China, I see 4 possibilities of the future, which I call, in a shorthand, ABCD. The aggressive China, a benign China, the central or middle kingdom revived, and divided China. Let me take a quick look at each one of these. Aggressive China means that China in which military forces would strike out beyond China's borders to establish a dominion over Asia and drive the U.S. out of the Western Pacific. Staff officers at the Pacific Command in Honolulu, where my wife and I live, tell me that Admiral Keating was in the commander who has just given up command, just retired, in China one time about a year ago. I was talking with a Chinese admiral, and the Chinese admiral said, Admiral Keating, we're going to build some aircraft carriers pretty soon, and when we do that, why don't we divide the Pacific Ocean down the middle? We Chinese will patrol and keep the peace in the western half of the Pacific, and you take your ships and you retire to the eastern half. Tim Keating, who is a garrulous and very gregarious Irishman, told the Chinese that he just didn't think that was a very good idea, and he didn't think it would go very far, which it won't. In a book by a man named Ted Galen Carpenter, who's in the Cato think tank in Washington, entitled The Coming War with China, he asserts that the U.S. and China are on a collision course over Taiwan, and unless something changes, an armed conflict is almost inevitable within about a decade. 2 conservatives, Jed Babin and Edward Timberlake, contend in a book called Showdown, Why China Wants War with the U.S., that China's military buildup is aimed at defeating the U.S. in any military confrontation over Taiwan, the Koreas, or in the Pacific Rim. Now recall, please, that Chinese forces, under the current government, current communist government, Chinese forces attacked those of the United Nations, the U.S., and the Republic of Korea during the Korean War. Those same forces engaged in border skirmishes with the Soviet Union during the Sino-Soviet split. They fought with India over boundaries in the Himalayas. They attacked Vietnam in 1979. And they have repeatedly threatened to use military force against Taiwan. Secondly, and quite the opposite, a benign China, in which China becomes democratic, beginning at the village and local level and percolating upwards. Bruce Gilley, the man I don't know but whose work I've read for a long time in the Far Eastern Economic Review, argues that this will be peaceful and is inevitable. In contrast, Ross Terrell, who is a China hand whom I do know and have equal respect for, he's a researcher at Harvard, he contends that most change in China over the centuries has been violent, and the coming of democracy will not be different. A researcher named Merle Goodman at Boston University says, and I quote, significant grassroots political reform have started to take place in China. The third of these possibilities, the revival of the Central Kingdom, or but probably better known as the Middle Kingdom, begins with the very name of China. Any of you who have studied an Asian language will know the symbol for central is quite easy to see. The symbol or the ideograph for country is a little bit more complicated. But in the Chinese mind, the name of China is the Central Kingdom, the Central Country. In that construct, back through history, for 4,000 or 5,000 years of history, China has been the Middle Kingdom, and other nations revolve around China. Those the closest are considered to be vassals of China, whose leaders would go and pay tribute at the throne in Beijing, or wherever the Chinese capital happened to be in that century. The Europeans and we Americans are seen as the outer barbarians. In this modern scheme, China will seek to acquire enough political, economic, diplomatic, and military power to dominate Asia without her armies marching across international borders. As in the days of the most powerful dynasties, other nations will become like vassal states, and no major decision will be made in any capital in Asia that doesn't have or another. It may be explicit, it may be implicit. A group of Chinese scholars has concluded that China's main instrument for asserting itself in Asia will be economic, not military. I think there's much to be said for that. A small anecdote about something that happened to me that underscores this point about barbarians. I was covering Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger in about 1983, and he was the first American Secretary of Defense to go to China after we established diplomatic relations with the Chinese. There was a 3 o'clock appointment for Secretary Weinberger to meet with Deng Xiaoping, who is the paramount leader of China at the time. And that was, as I say, at 3 o'clock. The press was gathered in the Forbidden City at 2 o'clock to wait for this event, the so-called photo op and that sort of thing. Along about 2:15 or 2:20, a Chinese officer came along, Chinese diplomatic officer came along, and he said, something has come up, and the meeting has been put off until 4 o'clock. Deng Xiaoping is being called away to do something. As my wife Fumiko, who's sitting over here, will attest to you, I'm not the most patient person in the world. And I started grumbling, there's no reason for doing this. This appointment's been on for weeks. Nothing in the papers or on the news suggests that Deng Xiaoping has been called away. And another correspondent in the back of the crowd said, come on, Halloran, you've been in Asia longer than that. You should know better. You've got to keep the barbarian waiting at the gates. And that's precisely what Deng Xiaoping and his Chinese staff had done, was to keep the barbarian waiting at the gates. I sometimes write for the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong. And I wrote a piece one time about Hillary Clinton's, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's first trip to Asia. Originally, that had been planned that she would go to Tokyo, Seoul, Beijing, Singapore, and go home. Makes sense. Those of you who know your geography, that's pretty much in a straight line once you get into Asia. The Chinese insisted that that wasn't going to happen, that she was to come to China later. And they forced her to fly from Tokyo to Singapore and back to Seoul, and then go to Beijing. And I wrote the story saying, this was keeping the barbarian waiting at the gates. And the South China Morning Post had a magnificent editorial cartoon. It showed a little woman, no taller than this, the Secretary of State, in front of these great, huge Chinese gates, knocking on the door, trying to get in. I happened to be in Hong Kong at the time and called the editor and said, I thought that was a brilliant cartoon. It really expressed what I was trying to say about the Chinese actually holding the Secretary of State sort of as a hostage. The last of these, divided China. And this is when the divisive principle or local forces become so strong, as they have from time to time in the past, that China breaks apart into warring kingdoms or separate kingdoms. Sometimes I discard this option because I feel that nationalism in China, and I've been in China enough or talked with Chinese in America to really believe that this is a strong force in China today. Nationalism, national pride of throwing the West out of China, throwing the Japanese out of China is so strong, and the government is so in control that this division will not take place. But then I see the reports about 85,000 incidents of civil strife. I see the uprising in Tibet a year and a half ago. I see the strife between Han Chinese and Uyghurs in Western China, and I put the divided China option back on the table. One other option goes into this equation that I believe should be of concern to Americans, and that is the monumental ignorance of the Chinese of who we are as a people and who we are as a nation. They really don't know who we are, and only a handful that I've ever met understand what motivates Americans and why we do the things the way we do them. I've come to this assessment from conversations I've had with Chinese in Hawaii. I've taught classes with Chinese at the University of Hawaii. I teach part-time at the Asia Pacific Center of Security Studies. We've had Chinese officers there. I've talked to Chinese in Beijing, in in Shanghai. Scholars who visit the U.S. Almost any Chinese I can get my hands on. I was with the former commander of the Pacific Command, Admiral William Fallon, in northeast China a couple of years ago. We were in Harbin, which is in Manchuria. We were invited to a banquet. And any of you who have ever been to a Chinese banquet will know that these are spectacular, absolutely spectacular. Admiral Fallon was very kind to me. I was not included in the classified briefings or in the negotiations, but in these social things, I, as the only reporter in the party, was allowed to tag along. So we're sitting in an anteroom before we go into this banquet. Chinese general here and his staff down this side, a couple of interpreters, Admiral Fallon, the American staff down this side, and he at the tail end. Pleasant conversation goes on, well translated, and finally the Chinese general turns to Admiral Fallon and he said, "You know, Admiral, you are the first American I have ever met." You could feel the reverberations down our side of the group there, of the crowd waiting to go into the banquet, and what the implications of this were. We don't know what they were, but a lot of us, and we talked about this later, feared that this would contribute to some form of miscalculation on the part of the Chinese. It was not a shocking event, but it certainly made everybody on the American side of this meeting sit up straight and pay attention. Continuing on with Xiaoyung's 4 items, or belief in the number 4, I also see 4 divisions or 4 categories of Americans in their thinking and their attitude toward China. The first are the demonizers. They see China as a growing threat, an emerging evil empire, if you will, that must be opposed at every step of the way. They tend to be right-wingers, or what some call neoconservatives in Washington. And they are ideologues who harken back to the days of Senator Joseph McCarthy, when a communist was suspected of hiding under every rock in Washington, D.C. The second group is at the opposite end of the political spectrum, and they're widely known as the panda huggers. They would be willing to make all kinds of concessions to the Chinese leadership, whom they believe, and I think with some merit, have brought China out of the feudal dark ages. They tend to be fairly left-wingers who also contend that the Chinese are right in their claim to the island of Taiwan. I'm going to assume that most of you are at least aware of the basics of the Taiwan issue. If you're not, we can talk about it afterwards. The third group of people are those between the demonizers and the panda huggers. They see China as a rising power that must be dealt with carefully but firmly. They see issues on which the Chinese and the Americans can agree and can work together, and issues on which China and America will come up with sharply different positions. Jim Lilly, who used to be the American ambassador in Beijing, was born in China, speaks fluent Chinese. I've met him a couple of times. He's a brilliant man. And in his book about his life in China and an ambassador, he says that China must be accepted as it is, not as we would wish it to be. China is as China does. He also has a very amusing anecdote in here. Jim Lilly is about 6'4", a great big tall man. And he writes about his arrival in Beijing, which is just before the massacre at Tiananmen in 1989. And the students and the demonstrators are gathered in the square in front of Tiananmen, in front of the Gate of Heavenly Peace. And he decides to go down and walk around and just see what's going on, see for himself what's going on. He puts on his old clothes and gets his bicycle and pedals down to Chang'an and to Tiananmen to talk to these people. And he said he tried to do this as incognito. he fails to explain how a 6'4" Caucasian speaking Chinese in old clothes can be unobtrusive. Lastly, a number of business executives and investors in China ignore the political considerations as much as possible and concentrate on making money in China or in trade with China. They're not much interested in Chinese power position or diplomatic campaigns or the potential military threat. In their view, most issues should be subordinated to economic concerns. As a very small shareholder in a few corporations, I think I'm sympathetic with that. But I also think, from experience, that if a business executive makes a mistake if he ignores A, the Chinese Communist Party, or B, the People's Liberation Army. These are very powerful, they are pervasive organizations in China, and any businessman who hopes to succeed there has got to take them into account and get them on board. I have seen Chinese delegations come to Hawaii and been in very pleasant dinners and conversations with them, and it takes about 3 to 5 minutes for anybody to figure out who the political officer is in that delegation. The others are either deferential toward that person, it can be a man or a woman. He or she usually has the worst English in the lot, and others are sort of furtive in the way they watch this person to see that they haven't got off base. This is just a small example of how pervasive the political influence of the Communist Party can be, even in the economy. As on the Chinese side, there is one other American factor in this equation, and that is the consuming preoccupation with Iraq and Afghanistan, the Middle East, the war on terror, the struggle over health care, the economy, and all its problems and other domestic issues. Living and working out in the middle of the Pacific, as I do in Hawaii, I get the feeling that our political leaders and our press, my colleagues in the press, really don't pay enough attention to China and its rise in the world. Just as Chinese suffer, I think, from ignorance that could cause miscalculation, so American inattention could cause miscalculation on this side of the Pacific Ocean. President Obama is scheduled, as I understand it, to go to China next month in November, and that will give us, I think, an important indication, a clue of what the current administration in Washington thinks about China and what it plans to do to build its relations with China. I just hope that the President listens to some really good China hands. We have them in Washington, and I hope that they get a chance to brief the President and he lives up to their briefing. What all this adds up to, 4 on one side, 4 on the other side, I cannot say with any kind of certainty where this is going to fall out. If I had to hazard a guess, and I would like to underline the word guess, I'd say the Chinese are returning to their roots and are seeking to revive the Middle Kingdom. On the U.S. side, I like to think that in the long run, the realists will be the ones who will determine American policies and the posture toward China. They will be cautious and firm, entering into workable agreements with the Chinese when possible, and otherwise keeping their powder dry. In sum, where there are 4 options on the Chinese side, and the 4 categories of Americans and their views in China, where that will come out, the Lord only knows, and I must assure you, He has not confided in me. Thanks very much for your attention. I'd be glad to